let's sort of rewind back to GTD
Yeah, please.
and your experience with, Meg's coaching with you and what this did about your life, if you're willing to share about any of that.
Sure, sure.
Because, you know, for me, I couldn't stop doing what this is about because to me, it's about creation and completion. It's about how do we complete the things we've put in motion, whether that's 43 lifetimes ago or this afternoon. And how do we then focus our attention on where we're going?
Sure.
So,
Yeah.
to what degree has that impacted, and in what way did that impact your life and your process?
Interestingly, it was more philosophical, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Um, the process of doing it, of course, helped me with work. Of course, it helped me be more organized. Of course, it helped me, get things out of my head and put them in motion. But the biggest thing, and I don't know if you experienced that, so please share if you do. So what happened was over the years, John, my husband, and I have experienced some interesting situations where maybe there were sick family members, or we had a lot of miscarriages and a few losses, a lot of losses, but they were very close together. And if anybody's ever experienced loss, first of all, I'm sorry, but second of all, there's a hard, you have to kind of manage that through in addition to living, right? And so um, I felt very strongly as we were going through all of this that there could have been more resources, and or the resources could have all been in one place, and it was so hard to find information about. We dealt with Alzheimer's and some dialysis and things like that, and so there were all kinds of things that we dealt with. And what was interesting was along the way, I absorbed all of these I found great resources, great people, a lot of great help. And so as I was doing this process, uh, and some of that started flooding back to the front of my brain. Some of that stuff that I learned started just kind of going, hey, don't forget about me. And then I started to kind of formulate this passion project to help people in crisis that I would never have done had we not done this thing. I think it's always been there. I think it's always been, gosh, wouldn't it be lovely if all of this would be in one place? Wouldn't it be lovely if I could help people in the world? But I had not started that, nor did I ever think I would, because it felt so overwhelming to, well, where do you put all of this? How do you make a website? I've been in comedy for 25 years. I wouldn't know the first thing about starting something like this. And then suddenly I started to break it down into bite-sized pieces. I started saying, well, if I were to do it, where would I start? Why do I want to do it? What would I want people to get out of it? How could I make that accessible? How could I make it sustainable? So I started to outline all of those little pieces using GTD, and it started to suddenly become more surmountable. But in addition, the philosophical part was suddenly people were put into my orbit, and maybe they were there all along, but I didn't pay attention. But suddenly I'm connecting to a hospital that's interested in what I want to do. Oh, and then there's a senior center that is just starting a new memory care facility, and perhaps I might start consulting with them. These are people that have been in my orbit, but I didn't put together, hey, how could we possibly work together? Or gosh, you're a great person, but I don't know that I'll ever use your services, or something like that. And so has that ever happened to you, where it just suddenly started falling together in a way that you could not possibly have done?
Come on, Gina. I never had a strategic plan.
Okay, me neither. That's kind of how
I just tried to deal with what was in front of my nose. I had gotten great internal advice that said, like, David, you've created in this life and many others more than you need to deal with. You just need to handle what's in front of you with perfection or elegance as best you can, and then see what shows up next. And
Yeah.
that's how I've lived my life for the last 40 years.
And it's interesting. I lived my life like that, but with the clutter in my head. I
Mm-hmm.
always kind of
Yeah.
like, well, this
Well,
could be interesting. Yeah,
the lack of clutter in your head helps a lot then.
doesn't it?
Yeah.
That's where the ideas come from, because I'm creative as it is, but then I didn't, and I never expected this. The creativity started going, oh gosh, this project that I'm working on, I do a podcast called History Bluffs. Oh, suddenly it's like, let's do this as a live show. And then suddenly this is, it's starting to take off in that direction. Oh, let's try this particular type of corporate idea for clients. Oh gosh, and it's all of these things just by, I think it comes from the knowledge that I gained throughout my life, but that was just kind of back in the back that suddenly when all of the other clutter was out, the floodgates opened, and they're suddenly at the front in the forefront. And now it's like, now my weekly reviews have gotten out of hand again, but that's a good thing because there's so much stuff in my brain that I need to get down.
People think the weekly review is such a static process. It's not.
It's the best.
It's the stoke process. It's
yes.
Oh my God, look at my life, what I'm doing right now.
Yeah.
Here's a new cool thing I could do.
Yeah.
So, thanks.
Yeah, it's 100% because you start to go there are times when, so this is a passion project that it may or may not come to life, but I think it will now. You asked me a year ago, I would have said no way, but now I'm starting to see little pieces coming together, and it also there's this weird law of attraction that I believe in as well, which is if you have this energy and it's being put towards something and it's a passion and a beautiful passion and it's something from your soul, people will recognize that. And suddenly these conversations start to happen.
They recognize it if you're authentic about your expression.
Oh, okay.
As long as you're real and say, look,
maybe, yeah,
whatever. They recognize that. And that's a lot of what Charles, I think in his new book, sort of validated. Look, I need to trust that you trust me and that I also feel like you feel. And that's a lot of what you just said. And so anyway, yay.
Yeah, no, agreed. And then in terms of the addition, then a deeper part of the philosophy was that I was having trouble with managing COVID, and I think that might be relatable to other people, maybe not. Kind of the isolation and all of that, and I started to have these panic attacks. I was told, and I had never had anything like that before. I perform dozens of times, a month, and don't ever have this fear. So I found that to be interesting. I don't feel like I understand completely why they happened, but I can tell you when they happened, I used GTD as well because I said, well, let me surrender to this because I don't know what this is, but it's happening. And then later when it would kind of go away, I'd kind of clarify, well, okay, that happened, and now I have to figure out, can I figure out why it happened? Can I? Okay, I can't. So let me take the flood, the stuff that flooded in afterwards and put that to good use so that that wasn't just a waste of a panic attack, and then like you'd have this clarity afterwards for some reason. And I can't explain it any better except that the more they were happening, the more I just talked to myself and said, why are they happening? And I was able to come up with you eventually come up with a reason, and I was eventually able to bring myself out of them. And I'm not saying that everybody can or should do that. I feel like if you need professional help, get professional help, whatever it might be. But for me, it was something that I could help myself with using your process. And I know that might sound crazy to people, but it helped me internally analyze what was happening and why my body was reacting to something that I wasn't even aware of until I clarified, if that makes sense. So it was a very surreal but soulful experience for me in many ways, beyond what it's typically, I think, probably arranged for. I don't know if you ever intended it to be used for sort of figuring out your psyche, but
I've used this and engaged with many people, and you've expressed it in an elegant way. What's up? What has your attention?
What has your attention?
And then what do you need to do about that to get that off your mind? Mm-hmm. Because on your mind is inefficient if it's still there. So how do I deal with this conflict I have inside of myself? Or how do I deal with this thing? And it's really, again, all about completion, meaning acknowledging what you have attention on,
Yeah.
and then finding some sort of a way out.
Yeah.
Essentially, okay, how do I move toward some sort of resolution about this in some way? If you don't, you're hung up in that spiral.
Yes. And
That's the anxiety. That's the disease of our culture.
yeah, and I
And
felt my brain was balking, literally balking, but I didn't know why. But my body was telling me something's off. There's a reason that my body was making me go into my fight or flight lizard brain for some reason,
yeah,
with something that I couldn't put my finger on. And then when I was able to analyze it after several times and like clarify, it started to become apparent that it was related to my brother. It was related to when I was younger and some things that had been traumatic during that sort of time period. Um, and then what was interesting is once it was clarified and I could kind of process it, then there's this beautiful gratitude that comes from it as well. So I feel like in life, when moments happen, I don't find them bad or good. Like a panic attack might be bad to somebody. To me, it was just interesting. Like, why is this happening? What's going on? I've never experienced this before. My body is telling me something, but so it was an interesting thing, not necessarily good or bad, but more after the fact. I was very grateful, and I think I told you this that I wrote your name down as somebody I wanted to meet one day because I wanted to tell you how grateful I am about this because of that was before all of this even happened. But I appreciate that so much because it's opened these interesting creative parts of my brain that I thought were buried, that I hadn't seen in a long time. And I'm fascinated by that. And yeah, the weekly review, I get to that every week and I'm like, oh, what's happening now? Like, what can we get done this week? So I love that.